Das war ein Befehl! Der Angriff Steiners war ein Befehl!
When you look up the word evil in a dictionary, you should find the name Hitler sitting right next to it. If you've heard that name before, I'm sure you would agree. Now let's travel back in time and peep into the extremely dark life of Hitler, the origin of evil and his rise to power. Early life and the origin of evil. Isn't it strange how just one man orchestrated the disappearance of an entire race? And though it's been many years since he passed, Adolf Hitler still seems to be the most perfect synonym for evil. The history of Hitler remains mind-boggling, and it raises questions about how a man can be a walking bag of wickedness and hatred. However, this story would never make a lot of sense to you until we pick it up from where it all started. So let's take a flight back to the origin. On the 20th of April 1889, Adolf Hitler was born in Braunau am Inn, a town located in Austria-Hungary, which is the same as modern-day Austria. The little Adolf was welcomed into the family of Alois Hitler and his wife Clara by 3 older siblings, Gustav, Ida, and Otto. And this makes Hitler the 4th of 6 children with 2 younger siblings. As expected, nothing would have prepared Alois and Clara for the shock that was waiting for them in the future. I mean, how would they have thought that their innocent infant would one day become terror to the whole world? Of course, no parents would imagine such a thing about their infant. However, maybe Hitler's life began to fall apart when he was a kid. First, his 3 older siblings died from unknown diseases at infancy. Then his father moved the family to Passau in Germany, where the little Hitler had to put up with his half-brothers and sisters.
It's such a momentous decision to go into Poland. The stakes have never been higher. And has he got his ducks in a row? Is he making the right decision?
I mean, it was such a large family, as his father had 2 other wives living under the same roof. Since most of his formative years were in Passau, Germany, Hitler got accustomed to the lower Bavarian dialect instead of the Austrian German, and this showed in the way he talked all through his life. Apart from marrying wives and building a big family, one thing Hitler's father was good at would be moving his large family from one location to another whenever he felt like, and this could have had a negative impact on Hitler while growing up. For example, just 3 years after they had lived in Passau, the family moved to Leonding in Austria, but they only stayed there for a year before they moved to Haffeld in 1895. Now, you see why I said Hitler's father was an expert at moving his family whenever he wished. And thinking about it, Hitler living his formative years like that could be one of the reasons for his hostility and intolerance for other races. I mean, he must have experienced that at least once as a kid, and he may have picked up racist beliefs from any of these places. Another factor in his early life that could have contributed to how he later turned out would be the enmity between him and his father. Alois, who was a bee farmer, sent Hitler to a state-funded school, and since science and technology was fast becoming a thing in those days, he hoped that he would do well in a technical school and that he would probably become an engineer.
Hitler was in a very fragile mental and physical state in the bunker in which he had been living for weeks.
However, Hitler had interest in other things that were far from science and technology. He would choose music instead, and this preference became glaring to his father when he was 8 years old. In 1897, after his father's beekeeping business had failed, the family moved to another location, and this was when Hitler started taking singing lessons. His passion for music drove him to sing in the choir, and he even considered becoming a priest. Yeah, Hitler was actually a devoted Catholic in his early life. Strange, huh? But things soon went south, and the new dreadful Hitler was formed because his father was not having any of his singing thing. So instead of allowing him to choose a path, Hitler's father sent him to a school in Linz, and that was where he started taking matters into his own hands. He suddenly changed from a bright and confident student to a problematic F student who was always fighting with his teachers and other students in school. His little sister also recalled that he went from a caring brother to a teenage bully who would often raise his hands at her. And, while they all thought that he must have been affected by the loss of his younger brother who died from measles, Hitler claimed he intentionally chose to become a rebel and perform poorly in school so that his father can allow him to chase his dreams. Well, his father did not seem to get the memo, and he chose to be violent with Hitler, hoping that this would change him.
Keller, and to seize the initiative at the meeting and to pin von Kahr down and the triumvirate to backing the revolution.
However, this only worsened the situation, and Hitler's rebellion rose to a whole new level every day until his father had to send him off to Vienna in the early 1900s. Another journey that would further shape him into the monster he is now known as. The metamorphosis. To form an orchard of evil, you must first sow a seed of wickedness and hatred. In the same way, Hitler did not become a terror overnight. Many people seem to believe that Hitler was a monster his father made. However, several other events in his life may have contributed to how he eventually turned out. Though his father's impact on his life cannot be disputed, it still does not fully explain the reasons for many of the evil things he did. While the real origin of his stone-cold heart still remains a subject of debate till today, many people seem to believe that it all started when he moved to Vienna in 1907. After his enmity with his father, which pushed him to Vienna, he decided to chase the dream he always wanted. I mean, his father was no longer there to tell him what to do, and since he was even 18 years old at the time, he could now make his own decisions and stand by it. So, he applied to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, but to his greatest shock, he was rejected. His world seemed to be crumbling like a pack of cards before his very eyes, but he decided not to give up. He applied to the Academy of Fine Arts again, but his world came crashing down this time because he was rejected the second time. Maybe it could be as a result of the bad records and reports he had from the times he was playing rebel in school, who knows?
Large country which he considers fit for repopulating with Germans from this expanding population.
However, Hitler seemed to put the blame on the teachers at the academy, who were mostly Jews. And we can say that this sowed a seed of hatred for the Jews in his heart. It wasn't enough reason if you ask me, but let's just say that Hitler had carried some baggage from his childhood, and he needed to blame everyone for it. After that incident in Vienna, he forgot his faithfulness to the Catholic faith, and he stopped taking sacraments and attending Mass. He chose a new path of smoking heavily every day, and as he lit every stick, his spark of hatred for the Jews seemed to be growing bigger too. And, soon enough, he met a guy named Georg Ritter von Schonerer, an Austrian politician who helped him to fan his hatred to flame right there in Vienna. He continued to live there under the influence of Schonerer until he moved to Germany in 1913, with his burning flames of hatred and evil. It was 3 years later, after the First World War, that the burning flames became an unquenchable inferno that wiped out 6 million European Jews and hundreds of thousands of other races. World War I. After Hitler moved to Germany in 1913, he was living in Munich until the First World War broke out in 1914. At this time, he must have forgotten about his ambitions of going into music or his futile dreams of becoming dreams. So, at the start of the World War, he seemed to have found a new hobby as he voluntarily enlisted in the Bavarian Army in August 1914. Though his acceptance into the Bavarian Army was most likely an error because he should have been sent back to his home country, this error ignited his journey to the seat of the German government. With his strong will as an advantage, Hitler was able to exercise immense bravery on the battlefield. And though he was always far from the front lines, his courageous involvement in the battle was quite noticeable, and he was soon recognized. He even received a medal in the end. However, he probably knew what he was doing, and the real medal he wanted was still far ahead of him. 2 years after the war started, things began to look like they were going haywire for Hitler. First, a shell exploded on the battlefield, and he got wounded in his left thigh. So much that about 200 tiny pieces of wood were removed from his thigh after the incident. He spent almost 2 months in the hospital, but he chose to return back to the battlefield, and his bravery earned him a Black Wound badge. One of his Jewish superiors also recommended him for a first-class decoration.
If there's a war growing out of the dispute with Poland, that Italy will remain neutral.
But this kind act from a Jew would soon be forgotten after Germany loses the war in 1918. Towards the end of the battle, he encountered another incident which had him temporarily blind and he spent the last days of the way at a hospital in Pasewalk, recovering from the blindness and hoping to return to the battlefield again. Hitler believed that Germany was undefeated in battle and the victory was theirs, so that explains why he was shocked at the news of the defeat while he was still yet to recover from the partial blindness. According to his own account, the news surprised him so much that he suffered from a second bout of blindness. It was after this defeat that an economic sanction was imposed on the German government, and Hitler seemed to develop more hatred for the Jews. Now, that would sound strange, because the Jews did not look like they had anything to do with the defeat. In fact, they fought side by side on the field. However, being a German patriot whose love for Germany waxed strong during the war, Hitler was fast to believe in the stab-in-the-back myth, an ideology that was formed by the German government after they lost the war. Since they could not find any excuses and they needed someone to blame for their loss, they decided to put it all on the Jews and Marxists. And their stab-in-the-back myth says that Germany would not have been defeated at the war front if the civilian leaders and Jews at home did not sign the armistice to end the battle. Since Hitler already gathered a lot of reasons to hate the Jews while he grew up, you would understand why he was one of those who first believed in this baseless argument and worked towards getting other Germans to his side of the myth. But apart from the fact that he was a German patriot, Hitler would need all this hatred and anger for his own political gain later on. I mean, the loss of the war was already taking a bad turn on the economy of Germany. So if he could get more people to believe that the Jews were really the pest that needed to be wiped out, he would have many people on his side, and that would increase his chances of rising to the seat he desired. Well, this anger and resentment seemed to work well for him, as he eventually birthed the Nazi Party, a massive political and revenge tool in the hands of Adolf Hitler. Nazi Party and the rise to power. After the loss of the First World War, Hitler continued with the army since he did not have any certificates with which he could probably get a job. For Hitler, the army was an escape from the life he was living before the war and also a stepping stone to the high places he hoped for. 1 year after had been in the army, he wrote a letter to a guy named Adolf Gemlich, and in this letter, he publicly showed his resentment towards the Jews for the first time. In the Gemlich letter, which he wrote on the 16th of September 1919, he referred to the Jews as germs, and that the major aim of the German government should be to remove them completely. Can you imagine the kind of corruption that must dwell in the heart of a man for him to call millions of humans germs? I mean, it's just disturbing. Adolf Hitler was one of those anti-Semitic people who believed in racial superiority and the idea of racial hygiene. He thought that Jews were one of those inferior races that should be wiped out before they corrupt the European race. So, under the guise of German patriotism and the lies that the Jews were responsible for the loss of the First World War, Hitler poured his hatred into the hearts of many with the aim of wiping out the Jewish race. To make his work easier and faster, he joined the DAP, later known as the Nazi Party. And this was where he met Dietrich Eckart, one of the founders of the party, who was also a loud advocate of anti-Semitism. Hitler picked him as a mentor, and this guy built on the anti-Semitism he had picked up as a teenager in Vienna. So, you can say that Hitler intentionally took training to become evil, and he had the best tutors from hell. 1 year after his involvement with the Nazi Party, he was discharged from the army, and that marked the beginning of his full-time involvement in the affairs of the party. He spent most of his days at the party headquarters in Munich, where he learnt the act of crowd manipulation and became very effective at it. Well, his crowd manipulation skills came in very handy in February 1921, when he stood before a crowd of over 6,000 people, and he gained a large number of supporters with his sweet words. Soon, he became widely known across Munich for his stand against rival politicians and his speeches against the Jews. He continued spreading his propaganda for months, and he soon became one of the most influential and respected members of the Nazi Party. And now it was time for him to take his hunger for power to the next level. Yep, he had a plan, and no one saw him coming. Since he was very sure that he had now become influential in the party, he kicked off on the 11th of July 1921 when he angrily stormed the party headquarters in Munich and tendered his resignation. He knew that, being the face of the party, the leaders would definitely beg him to stay because they wouldn't want to lose the Nazi Party and the influence it already gathered. And guess what? His plans worked out as he hoped. So, after a series of back and forths, he agreed to rejoin the party, but on one condition: he would have to rise to the post of the party chairman. He knew that they had no choice, and indeed they agreed. 15 days later, he rejoined the Nazi Party as a chairman, and now he had the power to use the group as he had always wanted. He started by expelling his oppositions from the party. Then he stole the hearts of the public once again with his well-planned-out speeches. He continued spreading his anti-Semitic propaganda, and everything seems to be working out well already. But he hasn't reached his goal yet. Some years after he had ruled the Nazi Party and gained the love and attention of the German public, he decided to run for presidency. Riding on the public love, he contested against Hindenburg for presidency in 1932, and again, he won the support of many with his words, as he always did. And, using the campaign tag Hitler over Germany, he flew all over Germany in aircrafts, campaigning in different places. Though in the end, his campaign tactics and gimmicks were not enough to get him the president's seat, he made a name for himself as one of the strong forces in politics, and this intro he made into German politics would be useful for him soon. In fact, the fruit came sooner than he would have expected, because Hindenburg was not really as effective as the public thought he would be. So, some influential people in Germany began to see the things that Hitler could have done. So, as if the stars just chose to align in Hitler's favor, but to the doom of the Jews, the influential politicians wrote a letter to the president to appoint Hitler as a leader in his government. However, since they ran against each other, the president was reluctant to do this. Well, he probably knew the kind of terror that Hitler was, but since the top politicians kept putting pressure on him, he had to do what they wanted. He appointed him as a chancellor, a post Hitler insisted on by himself so that he could gain control over the police. I'm sure the reason for that is not new to anyone. But at the time, no one really knew the kind of havoc that Hitler would wreak. He only started showing the things he was capable of a few months later when he used his position to enforce the signing of certain decrees. This includes laws that suspended basic human rights and gave room for detention without trial. He also started pushing his anti-communism agenda when he suppressed the activities of the German Communist Party and had about 4,000 members detained. Now, I guess this seems like a lot already, but it is not even close to the most disturbing things that Hitler did. When he was called the synonym for evil, it was not mere words. The Great Evil. Hitler continued as the Chancellor until Hindenburg's death in 1934. After the Hindenburg, the Parliament announced that the office of the President should be abolished and merged with that of the Chancellor. So this made Hitler the supreme ruler of Germany and the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. This was a good coincidence for Hitler, who could not run for presidency because he had renounced his citizenship in Austria, and he was not a citizen of Germany either. See how the stars kept aligning? However, Hitler's rise to power ended up to be the greatest mistake in German history. Few years after he became the head of state, he finally seized the opportunity to carry out his racial hygiene plans. In what is now referred to as the Holocaust, Hitler saw to the eradication of millions of non-German people, a larger percentage of which are Jews. In fact, this move of his started the Second World War in 1942. With the aim of defeating Poland, the Soviet Union, and most importantly, the Jews, Hitler commanded the deportation of these races, not to their home countries, but to be used as slaves or murdered. And by January 1942, he gave the decree that all the Jews and Slavs that are considered undesirable should be killed. This genocide was led by senior officials of the Nazi Party, his extermination tool which he had sharpened for years. Hitler used the Nazi Party to wipe out these races, and according to him, it was to regain their racial health. How evil does that sound? It definitely sounds as disturbing as the Nazis' methods of wiping out these humans were. I mean, just imagine a human walking on the road and they get shot just because they are Jewish or any of these races that Hitler considered to be inferior. The Holocaust, the brutal genocide, was months and months of mass shootings, which was responsible for the deaths of about 11 million civilians. Talk of old women and little children who did not even get a chance to know what they have done wrong. These victims were all killed in extermination camps, ghettos, gas chambers, and sadly, through starvation. Hitler even went as far as setting up a devilish program he called the Hunger Plan, a system that was aimed at reducing the population of the Jews in the conquered areas by a whopping 30 million. This plan involved overworking the Jews while depriving them of food. Food supplies were only diverted to the German community, and this led to the starvation of at least 80 million people. I'm sure you would agree that it only takes a depraved mind to think of such a wicked plan and even give it a name, right? Yeah, Adolf Hitler was that depraved mind. Hitler was so depraved that he had to paint himself as a celibate man with no other life outside the evil political mission which he gave himself. And though he met his lover in 1929, he did not get married to her until about 20 years later. Now, the most shocking part of this wedding is that he ended his own life, and that of his newly wedded wife, just a day after the wedding. That was his way of pulling out of the Second World War, which he started without having to surrender. However, it raises a lot of questions. Could Hitler have suffered from some kind of mental disorders that made him take some rash decisions? Well, the answer could be that he had suffered too much trauma from his violent father as a kid that it messed with his mind. Or, since his father dictated what he should do for most of his early life, he thought that an autocratic leadership could pay for that experience. While all these make some sense and sound like reasons for his evil acts, they still do not justify them. And years later, the whole world got to know that something else could have been the cause of Hitler's erratic behavior, or maybe a major part of it. Due to his bad health, he began using amphetamine in 1937, but he got addicted to it, and in late 1942, the side effects started showing in his behaviors and inflexible decision-making. In fact, the influence of the hard drugs he took was so great that he never allowed his military men to retreat, no matter how fierce the battle was, and this made him lose a large number of his soldiers at war. In the end, there is no one left of the Hitler's bloodline, and this may be proof that karma actually exists. First, he lost some of his siblings as a child. Then, in 1931, his half-niece also took her own life with Hitler's gun. And in June 1960, her last known sibling, Paula Hitler, also passed away. So the fact that his own immediate family also got wiped out from history mirrors what he did to the Jews and the races he considered inferior. But come to think of it, even if one or two of his family members still existed, who would want to be known as the relative of evil personified? I guess such remnants would have changed their last name and cleaned off every trace that they ever belonged to the Hitler family. Outro. All right, we have come to the end of our time travel. Hope you enjoyed this video. We would love to hear your feedback about this mind-boggling history of Adolf Hitler. Let us have your thoughts in the comments section.